History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Darkside podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Dr. Bradley Garrett is an American social geographer and explorer and author of 5 books, including Bunker, Building for the Times. Bradley also writes for The Guardian and has appeared on the podcasts of Russell Brand and Joe Rogan. I imagine during exploring, you occasionally ask yourself, what the hell am I doing here? So given the profile of these other podcasts you've been on, what the hell are you doing here, sir?
Well, Matthew, I love my work. I enjoy my life. I enjoy talking about it. And I definitely appreciate the invitation to come and chat with you about some of the things I've been up to.
Yes, it's greatly appreciated. I mean, are you well? You're in Malta just now as well, I believe?
I am. Yeah, I just wrapped up a week with 20 students from University College Dublin, and we've spent the better part of the week exploring subterranean infrastructure in Valletta, the capital of Malta. We did some research around the geopolitical significance of the rock, as some of them call it here, and some of the students even made it to an immigration detention center and managed to get these incredible photos of the detention center with a telephoto lens from a tree, which I was very pleased with. The students did a fantastic job, and but happily they're all back. They're back in Ireland now, and I'm here for one more night in this very strange Airbnb that's sort of cavernous. I mean, it feels like an underground space. It's built of stacked limestone and has this horrible reverberation in here. So the audio quality isn't as good as I would like, but I'm sure we can manage.
It makes it sound like you're in a bunker. So, like I say, it fits with your mystique. Ironically,
you know,
it works.
It is kind of a bunker there. So what a lot of the houses in Malta have this underground space where they quarried the rock to build the house, and this one in particular has got this kind of like, I don't know, it feels like a Turkish wet room. You know, it's got like a bathtub in the middle of the room, and you can sort of, everything in the room can just get soaked. But it feels a bit like an afterthought. But I was thinking, if need be, you could sort of drag the door down there and jam it into the stairwell, and you'd have a makeshift bunker underneath the house.
Have you got into the habit of doing that thing? I think like the British, the certain elements of the army, they're trained when they go into a room to look for, the exit points and all the sockets and that. Do you go into every building now and think, could this be a survival bunker?
But before I wrote Bunker, I did a 10-year project in London with urban explorers where we were sneaking into off-limit spaces. And that's actually a skill that I learned with them. As soon as I walk into a room, I look for cameras. I make sure the door isn't going to latch behind me. I think about how many ways I can get in and out of the building. When I go into a new space, I have a habit of opening everything. Every cupboard, every drawer. I try to get the windows open. I just want to get a sense of a sense of the space. But I think that's a tick that I developed with by spending time with urban explorers. The bunker builders that I spent time with were constructing their own spaces, and so I think part of the appeal to them was in creating a space where they could control the parameters of everything. they knew exactly how things worked and how things functioned, and what the breaking points were, where things might fail. And I think that's part of the appeal of the bunker, is having a space where you have this illusion of control.
Yeah. The book, when I got in touch with you earlier this week and you said you had some time for me today, I had to hammer through the book as quickly as possible. It is fantastic. I obviously highly recommend it. Ironically, given the subject matter, I found it to be a light-hearted, fun adventure. And you traveled the world meeting these people preparing for a doomsday event. Do you think that they are optimists or pessimists?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading the book and for reading it so quickly. I'm sorry if I put you on such a short timeline for the interview, but
no, not at all.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely. I sort of went into this project thinking that these people were going to be pessimistic, that they, that all of their narratives obviously are about calamity, about emergency, about disasters. They're thinking all the time about natural disasters, about nuclear war, about an electromagnetic pulse wiping out the grid. And you would assume that if you spend all of your day like running these thought experiments and thinking about, like, speculating on a future where disaster is inevitable and you're going to have to deal with it, that you would think that you would just run yourself into the ground, that you would become a pessimist. But what I found that's really surprised me was that a lot of these people, the more they had built, the more they had prepared for these events, the more they felt a sense of hope that they would cross through. They would cross through those events and they would emerge into the PAW, the post-apocalyptic world. They had this kind of, it was kind of a sick imagination, really, of being one of the survivors. Like, millions or billions are dead, and they emerge from the bunker into this new world. And there's a kind of colonial tinge to it, right? Like, once the world is emptied of half of its population, then we'll be able to really spread out and take control of things. And that narrative always bothered me a bit. But they were filled with kind of hope and passion and almost excitement about going into this world. And the only pessimism that I really experienced from them was in regards to their friends and family who weren't prepared, because they were worried about people not being able to make it through these disasters. And they were so firm in their beliefs that these disasters were inevitable that, you could understand. It's almost like a religion, right? It's like if you truly believe there's an afterlife, when your friends and family don't believe, you end up being incredibly frustrated. It's like, well, how can you not see that this is a reality? But when I started writing the book, I started the research for it in 2017, actually, and we were living in a very different world at that point, and their kind of concerns about, they talk to me all the time about pandemics, about war, and I just kind of, put it on the list of things that could go wrong. And here we are, back-to-back disasters for years.
Yeah, we're certainly in a concerning time. Your book mentions a little bit about the psychology of the desire to have a bunker. There's the perception of the doomsday preppers that they are irrational actors and often tied to conspiracy theories. But I suppose you only need to look back through history of the planet to see that it's actually probably a reasonable thing to prepare for at least weather-related disasters and certainly wars, especially given where we are in the current climate with Russia and Ukraine. The idea of dread, it's an interesting psychological concept. We recently had heavy storms here, at least as far as Scotland goes. There were heavy storms, and it led to power cuts and whatnot. And it completely exposed how unprepared I was, even for like the smallest inconvenience. I mean, despite personally having a sense of background dread since before 2012 Doomsday, I mean, I was not that I was all aboard that, but I was certainly had half an eye and concern, but I didn't actually do any prepping, as it were. I was just like, oh, what if something happens? What if the Mayans knew all along, sort of thing? And it's, I mean, living, like, you go through that and you come out the other end, and then it kind of gives you the opposite of the dread. You kind of go, well, what's the point of even thinking about these things? It's all nonsense. But then, like you say, it's a thought experiment. I mean, in your book, you mentioned Martin Heidegger explaining that dread is the realization that we are utterly alone and insignificant. But instead of nihilism, it should give a sense of freedom. As I say, I find myself caught between these two feelings. How do you feel with regards to that?
Yeah, I'm so sympathetic to your position. I mean, it's kind of if you spend all of your time thinking about these things, you can just run yourself down. You know, you just run down your batteries. I remember Barack Obama, when he was president of the United States, talking about decision fatigue, and then he had someone pick all of his outfits because he just didn't want to have to make that decision. You know, he wanted to keep some brain power left. And then I look at all these preppers who were like, you know, just constantly churning these scenarios in their heads. And like you, I remember that kind of 2012. I didn't latch onto so much. I think I was in Australia at the time. I was scuba diving a lot. I think I was just sort of ignoring everything, you know. But I remember Y2K being really concerned about that. You know, like, well, you know, what's going to happen with these computers? You know, they're not programmed for this year. It's going to click over, and then they're all going to have a meltdown. And then I was thinking about the banking system, and what would the implications be if there was no internet? And then, you know, it did keep me up at night. Of course, it never occurred to me then that, you know, maybe we should prepare for it. You know, maybe we should, you know, get your money out of the bank before that happens or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult thing to deal with. Kierkegaard also writes about dread, Soren Kierkegaard, and I spent a lot of time reading Kierkegaard as I was traveling around the world interviewing these doomsday preppers, because he writes about dread and anxiety in the context of a kind of overabundance, which I think makes a lot of sense, right? There's too much information, we have too much knowledge. We're trying to do too much, and so you end up in this state of anxiety because you can't, or you feel that you can't do any of it well, or that you're not in control of your life anymore because you're trying to do too much. And so Kierkegaard's answer to that, he's a Christian philosopher, but he says we have to take this leap of faith, you know, and once we take that leap of faith to decide that we're just going forward, regardless of our anxieties about, you know, what is or could be happening out there in the world, then it gives us a sense of peace because we have purpose then. And as I was watching these preppers, you know, make washing machines out of 5-gallon buckets and plungers, and stockpiling food and installing solar panels and trying to figure out their air filtration system. I mean, I spent so much time with them just like tinkering with stuff, you know, trying to figure out how things work and get them installed properly. I did find that in those moments when I was really focused on just the kind of practical work of getting prepared for something, then the dread evaporated, you know, because we were acting, and suddenly Kierkegaard made sense. You know, we had taken the leap of faith. It's like, okay, well, let's just start building for this thing. You know, it's like, let's just build the ark. We don't know if the flood's coming, but let's just build it anyway. And it was kind of cathartic in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I like you say, I kind of realized my lack of practical skills at the point when during the power cuts and whatnot. And it just made me realizing if X amount of people are in the exact boat, even if you're not necessarily prepping for days, you should certainly know how to do certain things just from a small disaster point of view, regardless of, the end times coming. It's has your opinion changed on the?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that.
Sorry, I was just going to say, is your.
Go ahead.
Sorry, after you. No, after you. Sorry.
Okay. No, I was sorry. We've got a bit of a delay on the line. But I was just going to say that the preppers describe that kind of low-level prepping as practical prepping, and that's actually the kind of thing that I find really useful to talk to people about, because like no one wants to build for nuclear war, or very few people want to build for nuclear war. But if you tell someone who's been through a blackout like you have, oh, it's uncomfortable, right? I mean, or the taps go out or whatever, and you just you keep going through your regular motions, like, oh, I'm just going to make some coffee, and you're like, oh, I can't, hold on, so you can put really basic preparations in place to deal with that. You can buy a really nice propane camping stove. You can buy a backup generator that runs on propane that would keep you going for a couple of days, that kind of I feel like the 3-day mark is the thing that we can convince almost everyone to do. Like, just put stuff in your house that would get you through 3 days without power and water. And then, in most circumstances, it's going to be resolved in those 3 days. But at least that way you're not sort of, caught out in the midst of some like kind of embarrassingly small thing, like the power going out. And it's like, oh, well, no, I'm just totally crippled,
Yeah, it's quite frightening the reliance that we have on basics like electricity and water. I mean, since starting your research journey, has your personal bunker situation changed?
Oh my God, yeah. When I started writing the book, I was living in a flat in Australia on the beach that had no room in it. I bought a Jeep Wrangler, and I put off-road tires on it and lifted it and put a roof rack on it and started. That's where my preparations actually began. It was like building the Jeep so that we could at any moment drive away. And I had sort of 4 full gas cans on top of the Jeep and some water and stuff so that we could leave at any moment. But eventually I drove, me and my partner, Amanda, drove that Jeep 18,000 kilometers around the Australian continent. And I found very quickly that those gas cans don't go very far in Australia. Like it would maybe get us, I don't know, to 500 kilometers. Like maybe we could make it to Melbourne from Sydney, but after that, you're on your own again. So I came back. I got my job at University College Dublin in 2019, and we came back and we shipped all of our stuff to Ireland, including the Jeep, and obviously landed in Los Angeles, and then the pandemic broke out, and we were supposed to just be spending holidays with family, and then suddenly we were there, and the preppers that I had been working with over the past couple of years, their words were ringing in my ears. They kept telling me, obviously a disaster is coming, you need to be ready for it. But also they would say that disaster is an opportunity. Don't fear it. Like, look at it as an opportunity to reassess your priorities, because it will force you to reassess your priorities. And damn, did it. I mean, suddenly we were home and we're taking care of family members. I had been traveling around the world for 15 years. I mean, I just had very little contact with friends and family except, Skype calls and whatever. And then suddenly we were home. And so then I thought, okay, well, since we're here, we should just start doing this properly. So we went and bought a cabin in the woods in California that's about an hour and a half from my parents, and like far enough that they can't drop in every day, but close enough that if there's an emergency, we can get down and help. And I started, I started the journey. I bought the backup generator. I started buying some dried food. Eventually, instead of buying that food, I just bought the dehydrator and started making it. I started baking bread like so many people. And I bought a 1972 GMC truck, which I started tinkering with so that I could, figure out how a vehicle works and be able to repair it on my own if need be. And then started doing house repairs. And, as mundane as that sounds, I've always rented, so I can't do anything to the places that I live in. But once I bought the house, I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna fix these boards right now, and I have no idea what I'm doing. So you just go buy a saw and you figure it out, and you figure out how to stain things and paint things and wire up chandeliers. And it does, when you start working with your hands and understanding how things function, it does change your outlook pretty drastically on what's possible and what you're capable of. And I think that's one of the great things that I took away from the project. That was a great gift from the preppers, was them just telling me, like, when this disaster comes, see it as an opportunity to recreate yourself. And that's what it did.
Yeah, it sounds like a very like you say, it's a positive thing you've done. It's optimism, but it's also personal growth in the face of what, like you say, it's a bad situation, but see it as an opportunity. In the book, I noticed the phrase "things started kicking off." It appears about a dozen times or so. What do you think? What do you think does or should concern people the most from the following list? Pandemics, the weather, the sun, aliens, nuclear war, zombies, power grid failure, economic collapse, or artificial intelligence?
That's a tough one. I mean, at the moment, we're all feeling the economic strain, but it does feel like, we're constantly drifting between these things. One day it's the climate crisis, one day it's war, and very recently nuclear war that suddenly is back on the table. Like, okay, we're going to go back there now. But I do think about the economy quite a lot, and how it's just all fake. It's all just, people are just printing money. It's all speculation. Cryptocurrencies are totally speculative. I always have a hard time getting my head around the idea that we've got this kind of, global exchange of things that we made up that are the glue holding together all of it. It's and the way that we've seen just in the past few weeks through the sanctions imposed on Russia, the ruble collapsing, their stock market closing down, it really doesn't take that much for your economy to just absolutely tank. And preppers, a lot of the preppers that I spent time with were stockpiling, gold bars, precious metals, gems sometimes. And I never understood that either, because it's like, well, okay, so the economy collapses, and then what? You're going to go buy bread from someone with a gold bar? You're going to like chip a piece off of that, or what? It doesn't make any sense to me, But what does make sense to me is taking the resources that we have now, and rather than letting them sit in a savings account that isn't accruing any interest, like invest it in stuff. Like, buy a truck, buy a backup generator, like get some things that are actually useful so that if there is a problem, you'll be able to weather it. And obviously not everyone can do that. Not everyone lives in a place where they have the space to do that. Not everyone has the disposable income to do that. But if you are in a position to squirrel away a little something, then I would say squirrel away some land, some vehicles. You don't need to become a hoarder, but put yourself in a position where you'd be able to weather something on your own. One of the things that I really got into when I bought my cabin in the mountains was chopping my own wood. So I got a permit during the pandemic from the Forest Service, and I would go out and collect wood from the forest, and then come back and just spend time splitting logs in the backyard. And I have to say, there is nothing so satisfying as bringing back free wood from the forest, splitting it and putting it in the fireplace to keep yourself warm over the winter. It really is, particularly if you've got some sourdough baking in the background. I mean, it's like the most satisfying thing. You feel like a fully capable human being. Like, I can care for myself, that all I need now is a bucket and a river, and I can bring my own water and I'm good,
Yeah. You obviously grew up in a country, and in particular a region that has an interest in bunkers and shelters. In the UK, we don't really have that kind of culture. What do you think accounts for those differing attitudes?
Well, the first thing is, and here's the geographer coming out of me, but it's just space. The United States has so many wide open spaces that if you want to excavate a massive subterranean citadel, you have that possibility. There are a couple of quite significant government bunkers in the UK, underneath the Burlington bunker underneath Wiltshire, and there is a bunker in Edinburgh as well. I can't remember the name of it, but there's
one that's open to the public for viewing.
Yeah,
it's called Scotland's Secret Bunker.
No, not much of a secret, huh? I have a feeling there's another one. No. I'm fairly sure there's another one, a derelict bunker, that I haven't been to, but I'm sure some urban explorers that I know have been into it.
There's one about 20 miles south of me, I think, just south of Aberdeen. Okay. This one. Okay, yeah, but there also are there's thousands of these bunkers that were built during the Cold War called ROC posts, Royal Observation Corps posts, and they were meant to house, I think, 3 to 5 people. And the idea was that if they were built during the Cold War, if there were to be a nuclear exchange, then a small crew of people would go into these bunkers and then monitor the situation. So they had kind of they had tools to be able to measure radiation levels at the surface, and then communications equipment so that the bunkers could talk to each other. And they would basically crowdsource all of their data and then say, okay, it's safe to emerge now from wherever you are, if people had made it through. What's interesting now is that you're seeing, just like you're seeing in the United States, in the UK, you're seeing a private market emerge where people have bought land that have these ROC posts on them, and they're converting them into very small bunkers and selling them on. I saw just yesterday an article about a bunker that went for sale in Norfolk for £25,000. You could have an acre with a bunker on it, which is kind of amazing, But you'll have to send me that link.
I'll send you the link.
I will buy
sure,
that right now.
But I mean, what a crazy period in history to have arrived at this point where people are purchasing their own personal bunkers that used to be government infrastructure from the Cold War, because they're filled with that much anxiety about the direction in which things are heading. It seems to me like in the same way that we look at bunkers from World War II, for instance, and we think, they've almost become memorials. It's like, oh, imagine the tragedy, imagine the suffering, imagine the aerial bombings. We try to preserve those things. We tour those things on holiday, to kind of remember what took place there. And then in the Cold War, we have this kind of conception, these bunkers are like architectural follies, like they were constructed, they were never used, it was a waste of taxpayer money, they're kind of embarrassing, particularly when they're these sort of giant government installations, where the government might have spent 30 million pounds or something building this, and then it was never used. And there's a kind of sense of frustration around that. Well, I think about these bunkers now that individuals and communities are building with private money, and like, what is the story that they're going to tell? Imagine 20, 30, 40 years in the future, and we're looking back on these things and we'll think, God, do you remember that? We had a pandemic, we had a war going on in Europe, which, who could have imagined that? Who knows what's coming next? Maybe the artificial intelligence fires up next month, and then we forget all about the war because the robots start attacking us or whatever. I'm being facetious, but it's it does feel like this kind of waterfall of terrible things that keeps coming. And my point is, when we look at these bunkers in the future, I think that they're going to be sort of monuments to this age. Like they'll be monuments to dread, of the kind of the terrible affect that we were all kind of collectively suffering through over these years. Who knows?
Yeah, I think possibly on a more basic psychological level. Certainly in America, you've got more extreme weather, with tornadoes and hurricanes, and people are a bit more used to, going into the basement, for example, just to avoid a tornado on a basic level. We don't really have that in the UK. I got a bit obsessed watching. There's a guy on YouTube called Ryan Hall who does American weather forecasts, or he follows tornadoes and hurricanes and whatnot. And I started watching him quite extensively last year when what was the hurricane that hit New Orleans last year? What was that called again?
Oh, I can't remember.
It was the biggest one since Katrina, anyway, I think. Anyway, he was doing really good coverage, and it just made me, really appreciate the differences in the basic weather between the UK and America, because you're having like 220 mile an hour winds there, whereas we got really upset with anything that goes over 100 mile an hour here. And that was pretty devastating here. So it's quite remarkable. It makes you think about climate change, certainly. And I tend to stray away from thinking about that, but it wiped out most of the woodland near where I live, and it wasn't that strong, relatively speaking. It does make you worry a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's people tend to associate the UK and sort of, on a short-term basis, like they're there on holiday and they're like, oh, the weather's crap. It's like, this is a hard place to live. But actually, there's no earthquakes, there's no tornadoes. In terms of, major environmental disasters, flooding is probably the worst thing that you have to deal with. But yeah, the United States does have a long history of, warfare, genocide, civil war, terrible natural disasters. And one of the theories that I put forward in the book is, as well, is that, when European settlers moved across to the American West, some of the first things that they encountered were subterranean dwellings that were built by Native Americans thousands of years ago, right? They run into kivas, they run into cliff dwellings, these kind of incredible defensive fortifications that were constructed because Native Americans were at war with each other as well forever. You know, those wars continued right up until European conquest, and they were brutal and terrible. So there's I actually heard a Native American scholar writing about collective PTSD or cultural PTSD. You know, that you can have an entire culture that has been just, you know, horribly dominated by trauma and tragedy, and that affects the psyche of individuals. It sort of just bleeds through. You know, that could be the case in the United States. You know, there's just like so many terrible things have happened on that soil that it's hard to get away from it. And so the instinct to burrow, to dig in, you know, to hide from things, to take up a defensive position is, you know, something that Americans have been staring at for hundreds of years and thinking, and it's, you know, probably just seeped into our subconscious as well, that, you know, if they were digging in, we should dig in too. You know, if disaster struck them, disaster can strike us too.
Yeah. When you see some of the provisions made by the likes of the Swedish, Finnish, Swiss, and South Korean governments, places where there are some survival provisions, do you think that the lack of provisions by Western governments to prepare and shelter the public has increased levels of distrust in these governments? I mean, at the same time as the lack of provisions, we've also got astronomical defense budgets, but the reality is we really only have defense against other nation state violence, and that's more offensive than defensive. I mean, especially when they're putting together bunkers for themselves, such as Cheyenne Mountain.
Yeah, you've absolutely nailed it. You know, there's been such a push in, you know, it's hard to categorize the West as some sort of monolith, but, you know, we could just go back to talking about the US and the UK in particular, because, you know, during the Reagan and Thatcher administrations, we saw this massive disinvestment of you know, government subsidy and social safety nets, and part of what was pulled back was any kind of provision for disaster for citizens, right? And you're right. At the same time, you had the government investing astronomical sums of money in building bunkers for themselves. So of course, the population's gonna look at that and think, well, hold on, who is this government for? These people are trying to protect themselves from a disaster that they're creating. You know, in Washington, in London, they're the ones that are creating these global disasters through geopolitical maneuvering and the construction of weapons that, you know, could have devastating effect. And yet they're not creating provisions for the everyday citizen. Then, yeah, you come to find out that places like South Korea, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland have created, you know, vast public spaces, public shelters for people, so that they can, you know, preserve the population of their state in the event of a terrible disaster. Of course, that's going to sow distrust. It's going to frustrate people, and I think a lot of the anti-government sentiment that we see today, particularly in the United States, is sort of you know, it's a knock-on effect from that frustration that people felt from the Cold War. You know, people got to a point, whether they're on the hard right or the hard left, right? People ended up at sort of the same spot where they were like, well, you know what? If I don't think we need the state anymore, right? How about you just leave me alone? I'll figure out my own provisions. We'll just go back to 1850. You know, I'll sit on my homestead, and I'll keep my money, and you can keep your government over there. I mean, I don't think it's shocking that we arrived at this point. It would be a very interesting what if scenario to consider, what would have happened if the government had continued investing in social programs, in infrastructure, in defensive structures for the populace throughout the Cold War and the boom of the 1980s, when neoliberal forces were tearing all of these things apart. What would the United States look like politically if things had gone the other way? We'll never know, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Maybe preppers wouldn't exist, or would be much smaller in number if people didn't feel a need because the state was providing that need.
Yeah, absolutely. That reminds me of a quote from the JFK film, actually, that the organizing principle of any society is for war, and it kind of shows that it's the organizing principles of our societies currently are misplaced, is probably the best way of putting it. We're not looking after each other. We're just trying to certainly start problems, as you can see on the international stage at the minute. Have you actually been into Cheyenne Mountain? Are you allowed to go in? Have you tried to get in?
No, it's really difficult to get access to it. They do a tour once a year that's obviously very sort of constrained. It's like doing a tour of North Korea. They're going to show you very specific things. But as soon as the tickets go on sale for that thing, they're gone in like 30 seconds. It's really hard to get in there. So I'll keep trying. Eventually I'll get in there. But that's not a place that I'll be sneaking into. I can assure you.
Well, at least to be able to have a nice Subway sandwich. Actually, I drove across America a few years back, and I found it remarkable how many Subway sandwich shops there were. I mean, they're in every petrol station. It's crazy, in the middle of nowhere.
It is great. It is crazy. Yeah, there's a geographer, J.B. Jackson, from the 1970s that writes about the American vernacular landscape, and he says that it's one of the things that comforts him about America is that everywhere you go, it's the same thing over and over again. This kind of endless repetition of fast food places, and there's a main street in every town. He loves this repetition. I remember reading that during my PhD and thinking, this is crazy. I can't imagine someone arguing this. They want to see the Subway sandwich everywhere they go, but he loved that consistency. He said it was the glue that held the country together.
Yeah. Whatever comforts you, I suppose. A few interesting quotes from the people that you met that I enjoyed. One of them was, they don't put tinfoil on your head if you are the president going to Camp David, but they do put tinfoil on your head if you take steps to protect your family. Another one of the quotes was, when politicians and the rich start building bunkers, there is something coming. We kind of just touched on this, but do you think politicians or the elite class are still major stakeholders in the survival of 8 billion people? Or do you think it is more likely that their psychopathic tendencies towards things like war will bring about a doomsday scenario?
I mean, you would never get a politician to admit that they would like to cull the population, but I certainly think that they wouldn't be adverse to the idea of losing a few billion people. If for no other reason than to take some pressure off of natural resources, so that we can continue our way of life, for another decade or whatever. But it does, the more I sort of looked into politicians and elites sort of, building yachts that were stocked with supplies to be able to get out of town, or building bunkers for themselves. I mean, Trump spent the first, 6 months of his presidency at Mar-a-Lago, which he has a private bunker underneath the golf course at Mar-a-Lago. And, it was pretty obvious that he didn't trust the government that he was running. Like he wanted to be on his private golf course with his private bunkers so that he could take himself down there if need be. And then he moved to Trump Tower. Remember? And he sort of blocked off all the streets in New York City and turned it into a kind of bunker as well. You know, when politicians and I would also say CEOs start acting this way, like I'm untouchable. You know, I'm creating this sort of fortified space, and you know, no one's going to be able to have access to me or speak to me or influence my decisions. I find that terribly concerning, and I guess, you know, this comes back to the beginning of our conversation. Like, it's easy to slip into a kind of nihilism where you're like, well, this is all just this is garbage, you know, like I don't want to engage with any of it. I don't trust these people. I'm checking out. But you know, there is another response, you know, which is to try and hold them accountable, or maybe build a space for yourself. You know, if they're building these spaces in anticipation for some sort of terrible calamity, then maybe we should take note of that. You know, maybe they have those spaces for a reason. Maybe we should think about having those spaces for ourselves. I mean, I hate to get into that mindset, you know, because you know, if you take it in the wrong direction, it tends to become exclusionary towards others. You know, it's like, well, I'm going to protect myself and my family, and you guys are on your own. But I don't think we necessarily have to go that way. We could start thinking about building, you know, what we might call intentional communities that are sort of based around sustainability practices that would allow us to actually divest from this government, from whatever government, you know, that we feel is not acting in our interests. And, you know, it could be that we're, you know, that we've arrived at the time where it's appropriate to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like the journey of survivalists you met was a story of attempts at building a community response to disasters, some of which failed due to various constraints, often financial. Self-sustainable community ideas certainly interest me, as did X-Point to an extent, which, from videos I've watched recently, seems to have developed into a bit of a community thing as well. And we kind of touched on this, but it's the reliance on the just-in-time economic delivery model and the lack of personal skills is concerning. Do you think, we have kind of said this already, but do you think that our culture is on the edge at this point and people should go back to basics, or at least try to?
Absolutely, yeah. But the answer is not. The long-term answer is not to stockpile supplies and hide. You know, the long-term answer to getting back to basics is about building community, learning how to grow food, learning how to fix things, learning how to build things. We spend way too much time in front of our screens. I say as I sit in front of my screen talking to you. But, you know, it's like, I would much rather be outside with you building something, or, you know, let's go build a car, or like build a farm, you know, plant a farm or something. You know, if for no other reason than to understand how those things work, you know. I mean, I'm always struck by, if we're walking by a place where food is being grown, more often than not, I don't even know what it is, right? Because it's like, you know, if it's a root crop or whatever, and it's underground, I'm looking at the leaves and I'm like, I'm not sure, you know, and then we're kind of, you know, debating it. Oh, I don't know, it kind of looks like kale, you know? And it's like, how did we get to this point as human beings that we can't even tell what a vegetable is, a vegetable that we eat, because we only have encountered it in the grocery store stuffed into a plastic bag? What a mess, you know? So that's the kind of narrative that I hear from preppers that I find very enticing. You know, it's like, well, you know, let's learn how to grow food. Let's learn how to can food. Let's learn how to build weapons and make tools. And it's, I mean, I've never been a gun guy, but like the first time you break down a gun and just look at its basic components, suddenly it's so much less frightening. You're like, oh, it's just, there's a magazine and a spring and a slide, and it's just, it's just a bunch of parts that you put together. It's a tool, a tool that's often horribly misused, but at least it's sort of like, touching the thing and taking it apart, like takes some of the mystery out of it. And I think that's part of our anxiety, or we might even call it alienation, that we collectively experience, comes from the fact that we just don't know how anything works anymore. And it makes you feel powerless, I mean, it's like, I don't even know what my phone is. It's just a piece of glass, I couldn't take it apart if I wanted to. I have no idea how it functions. And yet my entire life is on that phone and on this computer, and it doesn't feel real to me, I mean, this week that I've been here in Malta with my students, I was kind of, I was dreading it. I was dreading it, frankly, going to the airport, being shoved in with all these people, taking a PCR test, getting on the plane, it's all scary. It feels like so much could go wrong. But once we got here and we were out in the city, talking to people, taking photos, actually doing stuff, living life again, getting outside in the sunshine, I felt so much better, and so I don't know. Yeah, in terms of sort of getting back to basics, I feel like that's what it's all about. It's all about sort of, finding a community and building up those practical skills. It doesn't necessarily have to be about, and shouldn't be about, locking yourself in a hole and ignoring what's going on in the world.
That about, turning the news off for the goodness of your mental health. I mean, I've got a couple of grow your own kits here, lemons and Brussels sprouts, which I'm gonna start working on at some point soon. I keep telling myself to get on with it, and then other things take over.
Oh man, Brussels sprouts on the stalk look absolutely amazing. I mean, if you've ever bought the entire stalk, you can carry out on your shoulder.
Yeah,
they're so cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm the only one who eats in the house as well, though. So they're not popular other than to myself, unfortunately, around here. But yeah, the idea that nobody's coming to help in the event of a disaster is quite apparent. I mean, we mentioned Hurricane Katrina briefly. I've visited New Orleans about 9-10 years after that, and it was terrifying to see, like the watermarks of how high it had gone up. The still destroyed homes and whatnot. The lack of response from FEMA, people seem to write that off as almost just like racism from the George W. Bush administration, but it was more likely, I think, that in the face of that natural disaster, there just was no capable response. Certainly a quick one, a turning point in the minds of the general public in the realization that they would have to help themselves.
Yeah. One of the groups of preppers that I met were Mormons in Utah who were building these incredible apocalypse vehicles. I don't know how to describe them. They're like caravans on steroids. 6-wheel drive, bulletproof, stocked with supplies. They had snorkels on them so they could ford water, and they had actually. So they sell these vehicles. Obviously they've got a business model here where they're sort of not necessarily stoking people's fears, but trying to alleviate them somewhat by giving them these kind of super capable vehicles. And when I was interviewing one of the sales guys there, I remember him saying to me that you can't trust the square wheels of government, a phrase that I really loved. And he said when it comes to a disaster, you need to first look after yourself, then your family, then your community, and then if you have time, you can worry about the country. You can broaden your scope. And that kind of I mean, when he said that, it made sense to me. It was like, oh yeah, well, we carry this assumption, most of us, that if something goes horribly wrong, the government is going to, suddenly arrive with resources and they're going to solve the situation. But what if they can't? I mean, look at Ukraine right now. They're totally isolated. They're doing their best. We're sort of, ferrying in resources, but it's, no one's coming to save them. They are on their own. And imagine that situation taking place in the United States, where you've got all of these people with bunkers and food and guns. It wouldn't unfold in the same way. And that's not to say that what people in the United States are doing is more correct or is a better way of living. It's just the reality of the fact that we live on a planet with billions of people that's incredibly complicated, and we're dependent upon very fragile infrastructures to keep everything running in the way that we expect it to. And as we were talking about earlier, when there's any kind of blip in that system, it's really hard to cope with, because we're so dependent on all of these things. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's another way of thinking about these things that isn't pessimistic, but where there is an expectation that if something goes wrong, you are basically going to be on your own. That's a better position to be in, because even if you do get some kind of government aid, it's going to come to supplement the preparations that you've already made. Or as many preppers said to me, you may have an opportunity to use your resources to help someone else in the meantime, which is also a great way to think about prepping. Like maybe for those who feel that there's a kind of selfish edge to prepping practices, maybe people can think about, well, how could I prep to help my neighbors in a blackout? Or how much water do I need to stockpile for my whole street? If you start thinking about things that way, then it takes on a very different feel, because then it's about taking care of your community, not necessarily about taking care of yourself.
Yeah, that's definitely a very good thing. The flip side of that probably would be Larry Hall's converted missile silo. It's probably, from what I could gather, it's probably the most impressive bunker that you witnessed. I've watched a few videos of it as well, and it is impressive. I mean, under what conditions has he actually opened the bunker to residents? Like, is there a set parameter of, like, a checklist of, right, this is happening in the world, come to the bunker now? Has he done it yet? Is he waiting for something bigger than COVID, for example? If the tenants get spooked, can they just bug out and go there for a few weeks?
Yeah, so the survival condo is a sort of 12-story inverted skyscraper in the ground, and Larry Hall has built out, I think 24 rooms inside of that, and he sells those for anywhere from 1.5 to 3.4 million. I think he just sold a penthouse for 3.4 million in a second one that he's building, which we could talk about. But he was very upfront with me in saying, everyone that owns space in this bunker can come in and out as they please. But if there's a major disaster, and he did not consider COVID a major disaster, he would call everyone in and he would give them a timeline. You've got 24 hours or whatever to get in the bunker, and then we're closing the blast doors. And he made it very clear that when that time came, their ability to make decisions about whether to stay or leave would be taken away from them. And he even had a jail inside the bunker, which is I mean, I guess if you're gonna maintain social order in the midst of a crisis, I guess you've got to have somewhere to put people if they totally lose it. But it was obviously disconcerting to see that and to think about that, and to think about the fact that the people who were buying into this bunker obviously had huge amounts of disposable income. All of these people are millionaires or billionaires. And I asked them if there was any kind of selection criteria, like, do you interview people? Do you do personality tests? Like, do you want people's mental health records? Is there what kind of screening process do you have? And he told me, he said, when someone's writing you a check for $1.5 million, you don't ask any questions, you just take the money. And so I'm sure there's like a dystopian novel in here somewhere about the group of absolutely greedy and terrible people who end up stuck together in this bunker after the apocalypse, and they'll probably end up killing each other. But you're right, it was the single most impressive bunker I've ever seen, and I'm including government bunkers. I've seen a lot of bunkers that are built for heads of state, and they don't hold a candle to this thing. I mean, there was a shooting range, a swimming pool with a waterfall, a rock climbing wall, a cinema, a bar. It was quite a sight, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, as impressive as it looks, it's unfortunately it's not realistic for the majority of people. It'll be a very small minority of people who would end up in that bunker. You mentioned a dystopian novel there. Are there any Hollywood interpretations of bunkers that you enjoy?
There was I'm trying to think about films. I mean, Mad Max comes to mind as the great post-apocalyptic film. Totally unrealistic, though, as I pointed out earlier. A couple of cans of gas on your car isn't getting you anywhere in the outback. There's a great novel by Neville Shute called On the Beach from the 1960s, where it's based in Australia again, and they're in Melbourne, and there's been a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere, and this sort of radiation cloud is floating towards them slowly, and so they know they only have so many days before they're enveloped in the cloud, and that's all of the drama kind of unfolds as people decide how they're going to spend their final days. That's a good book. In terms of films, though, I don't know. It's just
Have you seen Take Shelter?
I haven't seen Take Shelter.
It's Michael Shannon. It's about he basically has an existential crisis about a coming tidal wave, and he starts building his own bunker with a shipping container into his garden. It's really good. It's about the psychology. I immediately thought of that when I was reading your book.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'll go and watch it. That sounds good. There was the film. Was it Cloverfield? The one where the guy rescues them, and yeah, that was really disturbing. But that was probably a fairly realistic depiction of how things would shake out in the bunker.
I thought it was I really enjoyed it. Because you've basically got an hour and a half of a psychological drama, and then the last 10 minutes is by mayhem. Not to spoil it for anyone, but
no, it is.
I thought it was pretty funny how it ends.
There's another short story that Cory Doctorow wrote. It's in one of his edited collections, and it's about things sort of going wrong inside a bunker. And I desperately wish that someone would turn that into a film, because it's just incredible. It's just a masterclass in deconstructing human psychology under terrible conditions. It's really good. I can't remember the name of it though.
Yeah, we very. I'll see if I can find it. We very briefly mentioned conspiracy theories at the beginning, and in your book, Denver Airport is very briefly mentioned. What do you think about Denver Airport?
I absolutely think there's a bunker under the airport. There's, I mean, we saw the aerial images of truckloads of dirt, being carted out of that because they said they were building an underground luggage system, which is absolute garbage. And then they said after it was built that the luggage system never worked properly. And if you walk around the airport, there's all of these signs on doors that say, tornado shelter, emergency off limits, electrical conduits. I mean, I've never seen an airport with so many doors that are clearly going to a staircase going down. But the thing that really got me is Obama, during his presidency, soon after they completed the underground luggage system, landed there, went underground, was gone for like 6 hours or something. Like, he was not in the airport. No one saw him in the airport. And then he came out and was back on Air Force One and took off. And I really doubt that he was underground for 6 hours looking at an underground luggage system. I'm pretty sure that he was down there.
I actually spoke about this with I actually spoke about this with a lady called Debbie Lewis, who did work on like government preparedness in the UK, and she's like an asteroids and whatnot. And at the time that Obama was there, it was at a point of high concern in the asteroid community about when a potential apocalyptic asteroid was about to hit.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Is kind of strange.
You just add a layer to that cake, that conspiracy cake.
Yeah, but I think that that to an extent is the problem with conspiracy theories. I think the layers added to them. I mean, the whole idea of deep underground military bases used to be itself a conspiracy theory, and then people have added on top of that things like underground alien one, these bunkers and whatnot. But then the reality is the truth is probably somewhere more in the middle. I mean, it's like you say, it's likely that there is a bunker under that airport, but then everybody says, "Oh, that's crazy." So
yeah,
conspiracy theories can be awkward at times.
Yeah, if you told people in 1972, there's a giant bunker in Wiltshire where they could evacuate the government from London if there was a nuclear attack on the city, and it's got kitchens and a library, and people would be like, "Oh, garbage, that doesn't exist." No one would believe you. But fast forward a couple of decades, and now it's common knowledge. So you have to be careful with conspiracy theories, but I think it's worth entertaining many of them, and others are quite obviously just absolute garbage. And it doesn't take a whole lot of critical analysis to parse those things, but I did find it rather frustrating when I was hanging out with some of these preppers and they were telling me things that were just obviously ridiculous. And I was trying. So often what I would do is I would divert that conversation to a more plausible conspiracy theory. Oh, well, that's very interesting, but tell me more about this. And that was always my way of getting out of those conversations. But God, some of them got really weird.
Yeah, I mean, I also will entertain anything. I'm big into conspiratainment, as I think they call it. But I think the problem we have in the modern times is conspiracy has moved from being a source of entertainment, and you could look at JFK or whatever, and like it was abstract. It was like, well, this event happened, but it was a long time ago, and there's all these interesting things surrounding it. But like right now, we are essentially living through the conspiracy almost. You've got like different factions, different realities, and ultimately it's causing a lot of these divides and instability in the world. And it is, you don't really know where to go for your reality anymore. It's It's strange. It must be certainly strange being in your position as like a highly educated person to live through this.
Absolutely, but it brings me right back to Kierkegaard. This is what he's writing about. There's too much noise. There's too much information. There are too many opportunities, too many choices to make. The easiest way to assuage some of these feelings of dread and apprehension is just to shut off the feed. To stop listening to it, stop following everything, stop trying to participate in everything. It's really hard to do. I struggle to stay off social media. I'm like totally addicted to National Public Radio in the US. They've got this 5-minute newscast that runs every hour, and it's like every hour I want to know what's the update, what's going on, and then I have to stop myself and say, you know what, it doesn't matter whether you know every hour of the day what's going on, because if you lived 150 years ago, you'd be waiting a week or a month for that news, and by the time it got to you, it wouldn't cause any anxiety because it was history at that point. So I think a sort of strategic disengagement from a lot of this stuff is going to be helpful for us psychologically and collectively, just to be able to talk to each other, get outside, go have some fun, go do something, go adventuring, do something else. But I also, and this is a slightly weird turn, but in the time that I spent in people's bunkers, I also found that they serve that purpose, right? Like, you go into the bunker and your phone doesn't work, there's no internet, and then you're just in there, building stuff or cooking food, and it was kind of unnerving in the beginning, but then it slipped into this I don't know, very like human pace of life, where it's just like your whole routine is just structured around shared methodologies and practices, and even the circadian rhythm gets broken. There's no day or night, so you just kind of go along with whatever is happening. Oh, I feel tired now, it must be nighttime. Who knows? And I don't know, there was something kind of it offered some kind of solace, that I guess similar to like going to, taking a holiday to a cabin where you've got no internet or phone. The first couple of days are kind of terrifying, and then you realize that, oh my God, I can read books again. Wow, I have concentration back. I can hold a conversation with somebody. It starts to help you after a while. So strategic disengagement,
do you think,
whether that's in a bunker or not.
Do you think, yeah, do you think in terms of like genetic memory, it's more likely it's what humans should be doing instead of being surrounded by blue light and screens at all times?
I don't know. I don't think there's any right way to live, and I've written all of my books on my computer. I certainly wouldn't write them on a typewriter or with a pen. So it's just like, it brings us back to our gun. It's like, I'd like to be able to look at this as a tool and be able to take it apart and use it as needed, but I don't want to be controlled by the thing. And so I think it's, that strategic disengagement, the point of that should be to get some agency back, to be able to actually like make the decision to sit down. Okay, I'm going to sit at my computer for 2 hours, and then I'm leaving. I'm going outside. I'm going to do something else. It's really hard to do, but I hope we can like, as a culture, start to draw some sort of boundaries around this stuff. And I know in Nordic countries, they're beginning to make moves in this direction. Where they're telling people, in France as well, I think, when you are done with work at 5, you cannot check your email, or they're even just shutting it off so people can't look at it, which is great. Putting more parameters around these things is incredibly useful. I've seen that just this week with my students. They got here and they're just, glued to the phone, when they arrived. Using Google Maps to get to their hotel, calling people to set up interviews, taking photos with the phone, posting them Instagram, posting to TikTok. I mean, it's just like, it was endless. And then after a couple of days, they were swimming in the ocean. The phones were, they kept forgetting their phones and apologizing to me. And I was like, no, forget your phone, throw it in the ocean. I mean, this is great. I don't care if I can't get in touch with you. That's the whole point of being in the field. Come on.
Yeah. What have you got any projects that you're working on, or anything upcoming that you plan on starting? Another book, maybe, or?
Yeah, I've been slowly chipping away at this book about biohacking. So one of the things that kept coming up for me, particularly during at the beginning of the pandemic, was these preppers kept talking to me about survival, but so many of them were really unhealthy, like overweight, drinking too much, eating terrible food, and I don't know, there seemed to be a disjunction there. It's like, well, if you really want to survive, shouldn't you take more interest in your personal health? It doesn't matter how much crap you have stockpiled in your bunker if you have a heart attack in it. So I've been looking into the biohacker community, people who are trying to control their diet, nutritional supplements, exercise, but also doing kind of more extreme things like getting into cryogenic tanks or flotation tanks to try and extend their lifespan, to kind of alter their biological structure to extend their life as much as possible, to enhance that survivability. So I feel like that's kind of where I want to go next. I've been thinking a lot about geopolitics and spaces in the context of survivability, but it seems like this is the kind of missing component in my work, is to think about the human body and biology. What do we need to survive in very kind of strict human terms.
I found a website, or it might have been a company, that had like billionaire investors involved. I can't remember. I'll need to dig it out, but it basically, the idea of like living forever and finding ways of connecting with artificial intelligence, which allows them to hack the human body, essentially. I'll need to find that and send you it. You've probably already seen it, but it's certainly I don't know whether it's a lot of this sort of futurist stuff from billionaires. I don't know whether it is comforting for the human race or terrifying. It's somewhere in between, isn't it? Really?
The kind of this idea of using technology to extend our lifespans concerns me somewhat, particularly when people start talking about freezing their heads or downloading their consciousness into a machine or something. I'm not super interested in those things. I'm more interested in people who are kind of like pushing the limits of what their body is capable of, not to do like exceptionally athletic things, but almost the opposite. People who are just being incredibly good at self-care, and they're doing that specifically to extend their lives. And there are some estimates by scholars whose papers I've read where they're saying, it's very likely that people our age are going to end up living at least to 100, and that the next generation will make it to 100, 120. And I'm not talking about sort of, like teetering around or being in a wheelchair, but like actually being a functional human being to 100, which is a kind of, if that were to be the case, I wouldn't even be halfway through my life, which it really excites me. You know what I mean? Like way more than surviving the next nuclear war in a bunker,
Yeah, of course. I mean, unfortunately, you have to extrapolate out the economic impact of people living that long and pensions and whatnot. It probably bring forth the need to go in the actually. But Possibly.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I'm one of the preparations that I've taken very seriously over the past couple of years is trying to get my not retirement, but just get sort of my financial situation in order for the time when I'm 70 or 80. So I bought the cabin. I finally bought a house after 15 years of kind of roaming around and living in apartments. I'm not interested in having a pension or a 401k or something, but I am definitely interested in having medical insurance and a house that's paid off, and being able to sort of manage my old age if I make it that far without having to depend on other people or the government or whatever. So that's a kind of I guess that's sort of playing into what I'm thinking about for this new book. It's another kind of preparation to think about longevity. You start preparing in a different way when you're thinking on a 50-year time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can people find more information about you and your work?
Well, my personal website is bradleygarrett.com, 2 R's, 2 T's. And you can find, I've got all of my academic publications up there, but I've also got links to my books and photography, all sorts of stuff. People can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Goblin Merchant. That's my handle, which is a reference to Warcraft for those nerds out there that are watching or listening.
I did wonder what it was. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, the Goblin Merchant is the purveyor of potions that you would encounter in the original Warcraft, and you would stop and sort of buy your potions from the Goblin Merchant. Yeah, so I guess my books are the potions.
Well, they've got me on board, certainly. Thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Matthew. Thank you very much for the invitation to be on. It's been a great time.
Join us next time for the Political Darkside podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It's just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.